there is no God, then everything is permissible. In a sense, virtues will be non-existent in a world where God doesn't exist. They say trust is profitable. So the very idea of trust is only useful if it adds to a company's profit. By the way, Adam Smith does believe in virtue, and he does believe in people being compassionate and sympathetic to one another. Imam Ali is saying, if you are in a market and you are engaging in some market transaction and you see that by lying this will increase your profit, then you should not do that act, because there is something higher than the market. Marxism and capitalism at their core are really one and the same philosophy. They are not different. They're both materialistic, they're both individualistic, they're both relativistic, and they both do not believe in an absolute, in the divine. When you enter a market and you're trading, interacting with others in the market, always imagine as if you're interacting with God, as if you're trading with God, because then you would learn to put everything in its right place. My dear son, so far as your behavior with other human beings is concerned, let yourself act as scales or mizan to judge its goodness or wickedness. Do unto others as you wish others to do unto you. In my article where I discuss this, I say the golden rule has existed in all societies across time, but nowhere is it most eloquently expressed than with Imam Ali. It's a balance that balances the remembrance of God and the self and others and nature, all in a interconnected relationship where each side benefits from the other side. It's a unified whole, basically. Being responsible means you have to work on yourself in such a way that when you come out to the world as a mizan or a mirror, you have the greatest positive influence on others that you can possibly have. And sometimes it's by leading by example. While in modernity, the very act of giving advice to someone, you are frowned upon. Someone will come and tell you, you have no right to interfere in my life. You have no right to judge me. Offering advice is not judging. Some people are self-righteous. They behave in such a way, we own the truth, we know the truth, and everything we do or say is the right thing. But this drives away people from around you. And interestingly, Karl Marx, and this is probably one of the points where we may find some commonalities with his thought. When he discussed usury also, he said that this is one of the worst manifestations of capitalism. For the most part, unfortunately, what passes as Islamic banking in today's world is not Islamic banking. In fact, capitalism is a system built in such a way that if you decide to use virtue, the system will stop you from doing that.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية. Today, this is the second part of our interview about Islamic economy, an economic society based on Islamic spirituality and ethics. And we are interviewing Dr. Ayman Rida from Lebanon. So we'll continue our discussion. My first question today will be about Adam Smith, because the believer has a value system where he follows and he embodies virtues because he aims for God's reward and he looks for the afterlife. Whereas the materialistic doesn't see any advantage or interest in maintaining such values. because he doesn't gain from it, or there is no direct benefit or profit from it. So this is my question, especially regarding to Adam Smith and his theory, where he can't see only profits and direct benefits.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين. Okay, we mentioned Adam Smith slightly before in the first part of this meeting. The idea that he believed in deism. That now some have argued that Adam Smith was actually an atheist and not a deist, but that's a discussion, a debate among historians of economic thought. For all practical purposes, they both will lead us to the same conclusion. And the conclusion is that this world has no direct intervention by a God. There is no room for revelation. There is no room for prophets. There is no room for scripture. Everything is man-made. Everything is from within. And if everything is from within, then there is nothing from without. There is no divine, no absolute, nothing transcending this world. There is no afterlife. So humans are left to their own in this lonely, absurd, harsh reality. And it's a reality where we become individualistic and materialistic, engaged in competition and survival of the fittest. Now, in a market characterized as such, where there is this idea that everyone is your rival and you are trying to, the way you can sustain yourself is by competing with others for resources, for livelihood. This is the complete opposite of what Islam is trying to present us, with an economy that's based on the ideas of man being God's vicegerents on this earth, that we are responsible vicegerents. We should aim to be just towards others, and that such justice, when practiced on a daily basis, makes us into virtuous people. But a market, the first model, a market that doesn't believe in virtue, in fact, a market that cannot believe in virtue, because for one, virtue is non-materialistic. And this is a very important point. When we speak of virtues and principles and ideals, these are not tangible things. These are not things you can see, feel, or touch. And because you cannot see, feel, or touch them, they don't enter into an accounting book. They're not numbers. They're not measurable. They're not facts. Facts, the way we view facts in today's world, not facts as truth, the way religion and traditions view facts.
So I can't control them. I can't use them. I can't make them under my control.
Or even for some people, they're not even real. And that, for some would argue that virtues are not even real, that they're just feelings and sentiments. They're just,
illusions maybe also.
Yes, they're just your brain neurons just playing tricks on you, basically. There's nothing to virtue that is of material value. And so we can discard them. We can ignore them. Now, even to those who believe that there are such things as virtues, and they do believe that virtues are real, and people do have principles and ideals, they would still argue that when it comes to markets, virtues have to be left outside. So when you enter a market, make sure you enter the market by leaving your virtues on the doorstep, because they don't belong in markets. Why? Because when you enter a market, there are different rules to the game. This is a whole new game, and it has its own rules. And its rules are not the rules you would imagine a virtuous person following.
This is totally on the contrary of the Islamic view, because
yes.
The scholars say when you enter life, any aspect of life, so for example market, leave your ego in your house and
yes.
come.
Yes. Leave your ego outside. That's true. And this reminds me of Fyodor Dostoevsky in one of his famous books, I think the brothers Karamazov says in one of the dialogues, it says, if there is no God, then everything is permissible. Now, there are two parts to this. On one side, if there is no God, then there are really no virtues, because you can only adopt and believe in a virtue if it takes you to something beyond this material world. A virtue is only worth what it represents, and if it doesn't represent something material, it must represent something that is immaterial. But if there is no God, then there is nothing beyond this world. So in a sense, virtues will be non-existent in a world where God doesn't exist. Another way of understanding what Dostoevsky is saying is that if there is no God, then people are free to do whatever they wish. Then instead of virtue, we'll have vice and sin and error and transgressions. Because the virtues are there to prevent us from engaging in vice and sin. But when there is no God, when there is no reward and punishment, when there's
full freedom,
full
freedom without any limits, and they talk about the death of God. So then I am God. I become God.
Yes, yes. Exactly, exactly. So if you have no idea, if you do not believe in something beyond this world, what should make you a virtuous person? Why really should you have an incentive to be a virtuous person? And now we come to a market. If I enter a market and all participants, all members of this market are not believers, they're not pious believers, they do not believe in a God, why should they be virtuous? What is the reason for them to be virtuous? The only reason they may decide to be virtuous, if they're playing by the rules of the market, is if the virtue gives them some positive net return. The virtue adds to their profit, adds to their equity, adds to their net value.
So then here even they use virtues in order to benefit and for their personal interests.
Yes. That's why sometimes when you look at some business discussions or business ads or advertising, they say trust is profitable. So the very idea of trust is only useful if it adds to a company's profit. So what this means is that the moment these virtues, trust for example, no longer adds to a company's profit, it is dropped. It's discarded.
But doctor, can't we talk about a personal innate feeling which human beings have regardless of religion?
There is. Now this innate feeling, in religion we have a name for it, right?
Fitra.
Right, Fitra or Rasul al-Batin. There is a prophet inside us. Yes, inner prophet. But of course the problem is this is like two hands. One hand cannot clap by itself. Islam tells us that you need the two prophets. One is the inner prophet, which if that prophet is completely divorced or separated from the outer prophet, which is revelation, then it would be useless. It will not have any significant added value.
Here the need of revelation, you emphasized before also on this idea that there is a great need for revelation for human beings, because we are limited and we can't know everything. If you can talk more.
And that is the prophet with Adam Smith's theory. That Adam Smith, by the way, Adam Smith does believe in virtue, and he does believe in people being compassionate and sympathetic to one another. In fact, his other classic, he's known for The Wealth of Nations, but his other classic, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, if you read, it's one of the most beautiful books to read, because it's all about morality and ethics. The problem with Adam Smith's theory, though, even his morality, is that if you take it to its logical conclusion, it falls apart, because it ignores revelation, it ignores God, it ignores scripture. Why? Because Adam Smith is telling us that the way we become moral as human beings is basically by us human beings within our societies creating the rules for morality and ethics. But that is contradictory. Why? Because in a market or in a society, who creates anything is who has power, who has influence. So if morals are created within a market, then those who are strong or have more influence within a market will have more influence over what these morals look like. And so this means these morals and rules and ethics will change over time based on how the interests of the competing groups within a market changes. But the thing about virtue and morality and ethics is that a big part of it should be unchanging. It has to be permanent. It has to be absolute, or else it's not morality. It's just whatever works. And this is why Smith ends up giving us nothing, because when he reduces everything to man-made, man-made is whatever the strong man can impose on the weak man. And that changes over time. Today, this group is strong. Tomorrow, it's weak, and another group is stronger. So what is right and wrong today, tomorrow becomes different. Tomorrow, we have a different right and wrong. And we see this. We see this in today's societies, that morality, the idea of what is good or bad, changes almost every day, depending on who has the power to influence people through markets, the media, trade, government, NGOs, and so on and so forth.
So ethics here are not absolute. So someday honesty will be a good thing, and another day lying will be a good thing.
Yes. So Imam Ali, this is one of my favorite sayings by Imam Ali. الإيمان هو أن تؤثر الصدق حين يضرك على الكذب حين ينفعك. Now, this is exactly what a virtuous market is. Yani if you have anything that comes close to describing what a virtuous market is, it's this saying by Imam Ali. Because what this says is, it's not the market that decides what the virtues are. The virtues have to come from outside the market and applied inside the market. Smith is saying virtues come from within the market, and we as human beings, we agree on what these are, and then we decide to apply them. So Imam Ali is saying, if you are in a market and you are engaging in some market transaction and you see that by lying this will increase your profit, then you should not do that act, because there is something higher than the market, which is your religion, which is your responsibility as God's vicegerent on earth, which is greater than any market, greater than any profit you can make. But today's markets, they justify dishonesty if it's profitable. The idea that greed is good, the idea that it's okay to not pay taxes, the idea that aggressive market behavior is okay. And so that now we have a reality where anything that's legal is considered ethical. And of course, legal changes every day. People make new laws and new rules. One last thing I want to say about this idea of markets and virtues. In economics, we all know the law of diminishing marginal returns. The idea that anything, as you use more and more of it, or you do more and more of it over time, its value diminishes. So some economists, interestingly, argue that virtues should not be used in markets because virtues are scarce, that people are not benevolent, people are in nature selfish, that most of us are selfish, some of us are benevolent, or another way of saying this, that most of our sentiments within us are selfish sentiments, but there is a small part of us that's benevolent. So what do economists say? Economists say, well, if our self is mostly selfish, and only a small part of it is benevolent and compassionate, we should make sure to preserve that small part and only use it when necessary, when we are in an emergency, for example. Because if we use the benevolent part, it depletes fast. It's like a scarce resource. If you use it too fast, you lose it. But that's a very wrong view of virtue. Virtue is not a scarce resource. In fact, virtue is the type of resource, and I'm sorry to use the word resource, but this is just to get my point through. Virtue is the type of resource that the more you use it, the more it multiplies. The more it increases in quantity, quality, value, influence, effect. A nice way of looking at this, في آية بالقرآن that says, قل لو أنتم تملكون خزائن رحمة ربي إذا لأمسكتم خشية الإنفاق وكان الإنسان قتورا. That the insan, even if you give human beings the greatest of virtues, they will treat it as if it's like a barrel of oil, and they will preserve it to sell it at the highest value. So خزائن رحمة ربي is infinite. But this is a human mentality. This is the modern mentality that reduces the infinite to the finite, that reduces what is absolute to what is relative, and that makes what is abundant scarce. But this is, of course, not what the Islamic virtuous economy would look like.
This is a great door to talk about the spirituality of Imam Ali and his theory in economics and his great sayings here. But before that, I'd like to ask about a question. If a person wants to embody such high standards of virtues, I'm not talking about being honest, not lying, or being just. No, we're talking about embodying high standards of virtues in his business, in his company. It is very hard. Because he may sacrifice, he may lose his business, he may lose many personal interests. So whosoever is ready to do such sacrifice, because in the life that we live in, maintaining general ethics are very, I'm not saying it's very easy, but many people can do that. But maintaining high virtues is something that maybe you won't profit too much, you will profit only a little bit.
لا تستوحشوا من طريق الحق لقلة سالكيه.
Because there is an idea that a businessman should always gain more profits and live a higher standard of life, a better life, a more life of luxury, even if he was a mu'min and a faithful and a very good person. So maybe you have another thing that you'd like to emphasize on.
Well, actually not very different from what you said. Let me use something Chesterton, who is an popular English thinker, said about a century ago. He said the Christian ideal, the Christian principle or virtue, was not tried by people and failed. People looked at it and saw it was too difficult and they didn't even try it. The same thing with Islam. And we talked about this early in the beginning, the question of riba and usury and so on. Yes, you're right. It's not easy to be virtuous the way Imam Ali or Quran or Rasul wants us to be virtuous. It's not easy. And that's why if we go back to our earlier discussion in the first part, when I said that the good merchant, the virtuous merchant, will be up there in the rank of the martyrs. Because what he or she would have achieved is something that is immense. It's something that is, I don't want to say almost impossible, but maybe by today's standards, it's almost impossible. But this is not to make it seem impossible. It all starts with small steps, basically. It's something that once you get yourself into the habit of doing, over time it becomes a habit. And the habit sustains itself, especially if it's on a gradual basis. It's enriched with taqwa remembrance, dhikr, prayers, worship, charity, sadaqah, قراءة القرآن. يعني all of these رجال لا تلهيهم تجارة عن ذكر الله. Why not تلهيهم تجارة عن ذكر الله؟ لأنه ذكر الله ينمي التجارة. يعني there is an inverse, there is a bicausal relationship here, that you are leaving the market لذكر الله, because only by ذكر الله, when you go back to the market, you can be a virtuous merchant and a virtuous trader. So it's ذكر الله gives you the tools, the set of tools you need to enter a market and be that virtuous trader that Islam is asking you to be. But yes, it's not an easy task. It's not an easy task.
So eventually a person would reach when he obeys the Islamic lifestyle. But there is a question here that in the capitalist era that we live nowadays, we can't even imagine a society that's empty of social classes, or الطبقية we say, because poor people and different levels should always be there. It is something that it's in our العقل اللاواعي, what you say. Yeah.
Yes,
so,
and
yeah,
and it follows from the story that capitalism and modernity is telling us. When capitalism and modernity tells us a story of man always in a state of war with other human beings, with his or her neighbor, with his or her friend, with his or her co-worker, then it's only natural that you're going to have a society with classes, and where we think of classes as something perfectly natural. But when you have a different story that says we are all Khalifatullah, God's vicegerents, one of the aspects of being Khalifatullah is that we are all Khalifatullah. In other words, this is a responsibility that is not for one group or one person. This is a responsibility for each and every one of us. And it's not a responsibility that I can take and put on someone else and say, you be a vicegerent on my behalf. No, I have to be a vicegerent, responsible for my part, just as everyone else is responsible for their part.
So everyone should be in the middle of the battle. No one can say, I'm staying back and I want to have rest.
Yes, the Christians, and this is what comes to climate change. يعني مثلا climate change. If we are all vicegerents of God, then we are all responsible, equally responsible, for preserving nature that God has given us as a gift. It's not enough to say the government is responsible, companies are responsible. No, we are all complicit in the crime, and we are all part of the solution.
Here, in talking about classes, any similarity here is found with Marxism, or it's a different story between Islam and Marxism?
Well, it's the same thing, because if you really think about it, and this is something Shahid al-Sadr emphasized, that Marxism and capitalism at their core are really one and the same philosophy. They are not different. They're both materialistic, they're both individualistic, they're both relativistic, and they both do not believe in an absolute, in the divine.
So even if we find some similarities between Islam and Marxism, but the whole philosophy and cosmic view of Marxism will reach to different goals.
Yes. The similarities are شكلية. يعني they are, and if Marxism presents anything that is in helping the poor, in helping the oppressed, Islam was there before them by centuries. يعني سبقوا الإسلام بقرون for Marxism.
True. Now, this is one of the important questions here in our interview. It is about Imam Ali's view about spiritual economics, and you mentioned in your article two letters. One letter from Imam Ali to Malik al-Ashtar, and it is regarded as an ideal constitution for Islamic governance, and it is also believed to contain universally applicable ethical principles, which also Imam Ali presents us with a sacred conception of justice. There is another letter to his son, Imam Hassan, which also has very valuable theories. And also Imam Ali emphasizes that prophecy aimed at tapping into the hearts of the believers and connecting with their inner prophets, as we just talked. It is about the intellect that is capable of viewing transcendent realities and doesn't limit itself with reason, which only works with logic and mental concepts. The intellect is normally referred to by heart in the Quran. It is a call to the spiritual depth that God has planted in the human being. And this is the source of consciousness in the human spirit, or the inner prophet, which expresses the revealed text inside a human being.
Okay. If you look at both letters, and there is, of course, both of them are classic pieces of the Imam's eloquence, his virtue, his singularity, what makes him special. But there is another way of viewing both letters. Both letters talk about governance. What do I mean by governance? How you govern something or someone. The letter to Malik al-Ashtar talks about the governance of a community or ummah, how to behave as a ruler, how to govern a community or ummah. While the other is how to govern oneself, how to govern your own soul, your body, how to govern your actions, your lifestyle. So one is at the individual level, the personal and private level, and the other is at the more general level. And the idea that flows within both letters is really very similar. The idea that the way a ruler should behave towards the ruled, the principles that govern how a ruler should behave towards the ruled, is very similar to the idea of how a person should behave towards others. And this will lead us later to our discussion of the golden rule. Because in his letter to Malik al-Ashtar, what the Imam is really presenting to Malik al-Ashtar is a golden rule of governance. That the ruler and the ruled are engaged in a reciprocal relationship. And the letter to his son, Imam al-Hasan, is again another golden rule. But it's a golden rule of how one should behave towards his God, his self, others, nature, and the world, and so on and so forth. So this answer to your question, I am going to be reciting from both letters because I think it will add more to, it will enrich our discussion by actually reading to viewers some of what the Imam is saying.
Sure, sure. I wanted to ask you just to recite some of the sayings, yes, because also in English it has its own beauty.
Yes, yes. In the opening sentence of his letter to Malik al-Ashtar, the Imam writes, "This is that which Ali, the servant of God, the commander of the faithful, charged Malik ibn al-Harith al-Ashtar in his instructions to him when he appointed him governor of Egypt. He charged him to fear God, to prefer obedience to him over all else, and to follow what he has directed in his book." Yani imagine this letter with the letters that today's leaders and presidents write to their representatives when they send them on political missions. "For none attains felicity but he who follows his directions, and none is overcome by wretchedness but he who denies them and lets them slip by. He charged him to support the cause of God with his heart, his hand, and his tongue. For he, majestic is his name, has promised to help him who exalts him. And he charged him to break the passions of his soul and restrain it in its recalcitrance, for the soul incites to evil, except inasmuch as God has mercy." So, Imam, in each and every one of his sermons and letters, always starts by God. And when we spoke about justice in our in the first part of this discussion, we said justice is putting everything in its right place. And the Imam is the perfect person who leads by example. So even when he is writing a letter, he is putting everything in its right place. He starts by putting God above all else. And he is telling Malik al-Ashtar that every act, from the smallest act of governance to the biggest act of governance as a ruler, has to start with you remembering God's place in this act that you are deciding to commence, to enact. And this is later on in the letter, the Imam actually talks about the golden rule that Malik al-Ashtar should adopt. أنصف الله وأنصف الناس من نفسك. يعني it starts with God, and then you go on to yourself and others. أنصف الله أولا وأنصف الناس من نفسك ومن خاصة أهلك ومن لك فيه هوى من رعيتك فإنك إلا تفعل تظلم ومن ظلم عباد الله كان الله خصمه دون عباده ومن خصمه الله أدحض حجته وكان لله حربا حتى ينزع ويتوب. So and there are countless examples in the letter where every time the Imam is trying to tell Malik al-Ashtar about a specific way of behaving with a specific group within his community, he should start with the place of God. Because, and this is what we said again in our first section, that when you enter a market and you're trading, interacting with others in the market, always imagine as if you're interacting with God, as if you're trading with God, because then you would learn to put everything in its right place. In his letter to his son, we get a similar meaning, but like I said, this is at the personal level. From the father who is shortly to die, who acknowledges the hardships of times, who has turned away from life, who has submitted himself to the calamities of time, and so on and so forth.
A full level of humility starts with.
Yes, yes. And then he continues, he says, when I confined myself to my own worries, leaving aside the worries of others, my intelligence saved me and protected me from my own desires. Here, intelligence, of course, is not reason only. Here, the intelligence the Imam is referring to is what philosophers would call supra-rational intelligence, or the hero-intelligence, the intelligence that emanates from our heart. It clarified to me my affairs and led me to seriousness wherein there was no trickery and truth which was not tarnished by falsehood. Here, and this part is really beautiful because it tries to give us a glimpse of how the Imam views his son. And if only we can imitate the Imam in how we view our children and use that as the model of how we behave with neighbors and friends and relatives and strangers and so on. Here I found you a part of myself. Rather, I found you my whole, so much so that if anything befell you, it was as though it befell me. And if death came to you, it was as though it came to me. This is the golden rule in its most sublime state, in its purest state. وَوَجَدْتُكَ بَعْضِي بَلْ وَجَدْتُكَ كُلِّي حَتَّى كَأَنَّ شَيْئًا لَوْ أَصَابَكَ أَصَابَني وَكَأَنَّ الْمَوْتَ لَوْ أَتَاكَ فَعَنَانِي من أمرك ما يعنيني من أمر نفسي فكتبت إليك كتابي مستظهرا به إن أنا بقيت لك أو فنيت.
Full empathy, sympathy, love, compassion.
Yes. Yeah, the idea, and we will talk about this later on, the idea that the highest level of feeling with others is to put ourselves in their place. And this is exactly what the golden rule is. Yani the Imam at some point is telling us as if he and his son have become one. يعني هو ذاب بابنه وابنه ذاب به. يعني they melted into one personality, because the moment he thought about his son, it was as if he was thinking about himself. And this, of course, will be reciprocated, because Imam al-Hassan, we know, looks upon his father in the same way his father looks upon himself. And when he thinks of himself, it's like him thinking about his father.
And we can relate it also, they both melted in God also, so God is in the...
Of course, yes. So when he continues in his letter, he says, فَإِنِّي أُوصِيكَ بِتَقْوَى اللَّهِ. Always the Imam أُوصِيكَ بِتَقْوَى اللَّهِ وَلُزُومَ أَمْرِهِ وَعِمَارَةَ قَلْبِكَ بِذِكْرِهِ. These are very similar to the themes in the letter to Malik al-Ashtar. You start with God, and then you move on to our relationship with others, which is governed by the golden rule. And then we come to what the golden rule is that he presents. يا بني اجعل نفسك ميزانا فيما بينك وبين غيرك فأحبب لغيرك ما تحب لنفسك واكره له ما تكره لها ولا تظلم كما لا تحب أن تظلم, and so on and so forth. My dear son, so far as your behavior with other human beings is concerned, let yourself act as scales or mizan to judge its goodness or wickedness. Do unto others as you wish others to do unto you. In my article where I discuss this, I say the golden rule has existed in all societies across time, but nowhere is it most eloquently expressed than with Imam Ali. Because he elaborates on what the golden rule is. To him, the golden rule is not this generic, abstract rule that sounds beautiful, but when we come to implement it, we realize it's empty because we have removed all meaning from it. To him, the golden rule starts with God. And as long as God is the first principle that governs our golden rule, then the golden rule will end up having an effect on how we behave towards others. And that is, as we're going to explain later on, is what really creates a virtuous market.
Very great. Let us here go more in deep in the golden rules. One of the golden rules you mentioned is loving God and thus loving others by the concept of the mirror. So you mentioned, and a quote, or it's the same meaning, purify your heart so that it becomes a manifestation of God's names and qualities, and you can understand the Quranic mysteries and secrets. An enlightened soul is a source of virtues toward others. Treat others with high moral standards, full love and mercy, and be careful from dust being gathered on the mirror of your heart. So you have to polish your mirror always. Otherwise, you will lose its beauty. A clean mirror of the heart is your path to discover your real being. And this is also related with Imam Ali's saying in the Quran when they talk about the heart, not only the intellectual and the conceptual understanding of a human being, whereas they emphasize that a human being is a more deep creature than only where we limit him with understanding and concepts and rationality.
Yes, so the concept of a mirror, the way I understand it, is very similar to the concept of a mizan or scale. Because when you're adopting the golden rule, how does the Imam say you adopt the golden rule? He says, make yourself a mizan. Yani, let me go back a little bit to our definition of justice. What does justice say? Justice says we have to give everything its due, or give every person what is properly his or hers. Now, if I want to be just with you, for example, Hadi, in anything we're doing, if I decide I want to be a just person with you, and by being just, I want to give you what is yours and what is your right, the first step I have to take is to imagine myself in your place. Now, this will not be the same. I will never be exactly you. So I will miss a few things about what you feel or what your circumstances are. But as another person who is trying to interact with you, the best thing I can do is to imagine myself in the best way possible in your place. This way I understand what it is, what are my obligations towards you. And this is such a beautiful concept. Why? Because in modernity, which speaks of individualism, that each person is unique, modernity and liberalism are the two the ideology that best removes any singularity or uniqueness to any person. It reduces us all to one-dimensional unit. Religion is what celebrates what makes us different.
So identical homogeneous products in a market, so we become like this.
Yes, that's the perfect model in economics, right? We're all homogeneous and we're all exactly the same. And modernity is going to take us to a reality where we actually become all homogeneous and one and the same. They're removing all the differences one at a time. Anything that real pluralism, real diversity, real richness is in religion. It is not in the ideologies that came from the Enlightenment. So how can anything be greater than someone who says, every time I interact with someone else, I imagine myself to be in their place? Now, there's something important here. Who is imagining himself or herself in their place? It's not any person. Yani when Imam says, do unto others as you would like others to do unto you, who are you? Who is this self that is acting as a mizan? It's not any self. It's a self that is pious and just. It's a self that has already included within it this reverence to God, this gratitude towards God. Yani it's a self that appreciates its role as a vicegerent of God. It's a self that feels responsible towards others. Because if I do unto others as others do unto me, well, let's take an example. Modern societies today are in some societies, euthanasia is legal, which is the freedom to kill yourself. When some people reach old age, they ask that some doctors inject them with something that gives them a swift death. But what this means, if this individual who wishes so upon himself or herself applies the golden rule, then this individual should also wish that everyone else have the freedom to die in the same way. But that is not what the golden rule is, the way the Imam is trying to teach us. In the contrary, the Imam is saying, if you are God's vicegerent, and that should always come before you apply the golden rule, then when you apply the golden rule, you know that at God's vicegerent, the most sacred gift God gave us is our life. Then you would never wish others to take their own life, because you would never wish you to lose this life, which is the gift that God gave you. So this is the idea of al-mizan. Yani someone who you're putting yourself as a mizan, but it's a mizan, it's a right balance. It's a balance that has achieved internal or inner equilibrium or harmony. It's a balance that balances the remembrance of God and the self and others and nature all in a interconnected relationship where each side benefits from the other side. It's a unified whole, basically. It's a holistic approach to how we behave with others. Now, where does the mirror come in? This self that is the mizan or the scale, this is the self that can be a polished mirror, as opposed to being a dirty mirror or a filthy mirror or a tarnished mirror. Because this self, when it's pious and just and virtuous, when others look at it, they only see purity, they only see beauty, they only see something that is worth looking at, something worth learning from. And then you reflect all that is great in you, because you are a polished mirror, you are a clean mirror that reflects everything.
So you like to help them and cooperate with them and
yes.
deal with their weaknesses and...
Yes, yes.
And such, to add, we have the great saying that says a believer is the mirror of his fellow believer, and we can understand it with two levels. First, a faithful person is a mirror of God in his names and qualities, and then he will be a mirror of his friends and relatives and other people of faith.
Right. This, see, one of the most important concept in modernity and capitalism is the idea of freedom. All of liberalism, which is the ideology within which capitalism and modernity developed, is liberalism. Now, liberalism holds freedom as its highest ideal. But what do they mean by freedom? Freedom is the freedom to leave others to do what they wish, freedom to let each and every other person live their life the way they see fit. What does this mean?
In the beginning, it seems a very good value. It's
yes,
that
it's a very good. It's very tempting. It's very tempting. But what does this mean? It means that if you see your friend on the verge of committing a sin or an act that threatens their life,
you have no right to intervene.
You have no right to intervene because they are exercising the greatest ideal in modern capitalism, and that is their freedom. In Islam, one of the biggest virtues, the most important virtues of a believer, al-amr bil-ma'ruf wal-nahy an-al-munkar, enjoining what is good and forbidding what is evil. And this is where a mirror comes in. And this is where the mizan and the scales come in. And this is where وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا وَكُنْتُمْ شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَكَانَ الرَّسُولُ شَهِيدًا عَلَيْكُمْ. Islam tells us, yes, you value other people's freedom. But that freedom is defined in such a way that you also should have the freedom to be a guide to others. And you have an obligation to inform a friend, a relative, a neighbor, a stranger, that what you are doing...
You have the freedom to raise the spiritual status of other people.
Yes, yes, yes. So, and this all leads back to the idea of being a vicegerent. Being a vicegerent means you are a responsible human being. Being responsible means you have to work on yourself in such a way that when you come out to the world as a mizan or a mirror, you have the greatest positive influence on others that you can possibly have. And sometimes it's by leading by example. Sometimes it's not by standing in the middle of a saha and lecturing people and preaching people. Sometimes it's leading by example. And we all know that a million words sometimes will not have the same effect as one simple act of kindness or compassion. But at the same time, Islam stresses this obligation. While in modernity, the very act of giving advice to someone, you are frowned upon. Someone will come and tell you, you have no right to interfere in my life. You have no right to judge me. Offering advice is not judging. Offering advice is helping. But we have flipped the meaning of these beautiful virtues we have. How can a friend be a friend if all he or she ever does is give complete freedom to the other to do as they wish to do? That is not what friendship means. Friendship is for you to put yourself in the place of your friend and then wish for your friend the best possible life. But that only happens by opening your hearts to one another. That only happens by the one giving the advice being humble and non-condescending, non-hypocritical. Non-hypocritical is important because you cannot offer advice and then after some time your friend discovers that no one contradicts that advice more than you. Imam Ali, I don't remember the exact word, but that every virtue he preached, he practiced it before preaching it.
لما تقولون ما لا تفعلون, also in the Quran.
Yes, yes. And just as the one giving advice should be humble enough to present the advice in a friendly manner, never being forceful. The other person
being amr bil ma'ruf and loving for other people to be virtuous, but
yes,
not judging people also in the same
yes,
time. So there is a beauty in the Islamic
yes,
ethics.
ولا تكن فظا غليظ القلب.
ولو كنت فظا غليظ القلب لانفضوا من حولك.
انفضوا من حولك. يعني some people are self-righteous. يعني they behave in such a way. We own the truth. We know the truth, and everything we do or say is the right thing. But this drives away people from around you. And on the other hand, those receiving guidance or advice should have an open mind. Yani, if someone is giving you good advice, that means this is a person who cares about you. And one should trust those who care about you.
We are reaching to the end of this very beneficial talk, but one of the main questions that I'd like to raise here also is the problem of usury. So the question here, given this virtuous system that we talked about, why usury system is the main problem of the capitalist system in the Islamic view? Whereas the defenders may say that money will be circulated and invested back to develop the economic cycle, create jobs, and help traders to gain some profit based on the capital that they own. So what's the major problem about usury? And in the Quran it's like being against God, or حرب فأذنوا بحرب من
فأذنوا بحرب من الله ورسوله. No. Okay. Now, what's interesting about usury is, even though it's not the only problem with capitalism, but if you have to choose one thing about modernity or capitalism that is symbolic of what this system is about, it's usury. And interestingly, Karl Marx, and this is probably one of the points where we may find some commonalities with his thought. When he discussed usury also, he said that this is one of the worst manifestations of capitalism. And it's interesting how the Quran views usury. Those who devour usury shall not rise, except as one rises who is felled by the touch of shaitan. يمسه. It's as if, look at the التعبير في القرآن.
يتخبطه الشيطان من المس.
يتخبطه الشيطان من المس. This is the worst possible state that a person can find himself or herself. Why? Because that person has engaged in usury. But let me say something about how the term usury was used in medieval times. In medieval times, in both Islam and Christianity, when people say usury or riba, it didn't only mean lending at an interest. In fact, it was used as a general term for all the transactions that happen in a market where one side is taking advantage of another side. So it was used as a label. So even if the market activity was not really about a lender charging an interest on a borrower, it's still, when people will talk about, for example, a seller selling his goods or her goods at a very high price, taking advantage of customers or buyers, people will say this person is being usurious, or he's engaged in riba. So it was used as this general term. Now, in its more specific meaning, it's the idea that, well, one side is imposing interest on another. Now, interest in this case is any interest. So some Christian scholars, and now we have some Muslim scholars, Muslim economists, they try to make a distinction between interest and usury, where usury is very high interest rates and interest is acceptable interest rates. In Islam, there is no such distinction between interest and usury. Any interest, 0 or 20 or 50%, is considered riba. Now, why is riba or interest on lending considered haram? Why is it considered a sin? Now, alhamdulillah, in Islam, we still have the majority opinion that insists that all interest is usury. In Christianity, for example, for the most part, the Christian world has accepted interest as part of their reality, as part of their economies, and very few Christians today criticize interest. They only criticize it sometimes when you have a financial crisis, or you have someone in the news who's charging 40% interest on interest rates, and so on and so forth. But at some point they compromised on the rule, and they made exceptions, and these exceptions became the normal, and the whole Christian ban on usury just fell apart. So why does Islam have such a very strong position against usury? Because let's go back to the idea of justice. Justice is putting everything in its proper place. So when you, as a borrower, you come to a lender and say, please lend me X dollars, or X dananir, or darahim, and the lender says, okay, that is fine, I am willing to lend you some money, but I have a condition. My condition is I need some return on this investment. And the condition is that this return has to be predetermined, fixed, and is not it's not liable to risk. So whether you, when you take this money and spend it or invest it, whether you make a profit or loss, I, as the lender, I am guaranteed a positive return or interest on this money that I am lending you. This in Islam is what we consider riba and haram. Why? Because there is no justice. This is injustice. Because any return you receive is not return you deserve. So that money or return you are receiving is not money going to its right place. So it is not just. But some will say, and this is the economic justification for interest, they would say, but this lender has money on the side, and this lender, by lending out this money, is losing on the opportunity to earn interest on this money or profit if he or she had invested it in something else. But there is a contradiction here. Because if I am a lender, and you come to me, and I was going to use this money I had to invest it in somewhere else, then I should have already invested it somewhere else. If I was not going to invest it, I was just going to keep it in a safe or a bank, then why should I earn interest by lending it? And in both cases, you do not deserve the return. You are going to keep the money anyway and not use it. So why not just lend money? وَلَكُمْ رُؤُوسُ أَمْوَالِكُمْ. Okay, so this is what in economics we call the opportunity cost.
You're paying the service that this bank or that bank offered you. So
now a service is different, right? And if this awalan Shahid al-Sadr came up, of course he did not come up with it, but he developed the idea of profit loss mechanism, al-murabaha. And then عندك المرابحة المضاربة and so on. We're not going to get into these details, but the idea is a profit-loss partnership where the lender and the borrower will both engage in this investment. They divide profits and they divide losses.
But so in the current bank systems that are trying to call themselves Islamic banks or such in some Islamic countries, when you ask them, they say it's the same process, it's only changing the names and changing the documents that people sign with. So
for the most part, yes. For the most part, unfortunately, what passes as Islamic banking in today's world is not Islamic banking. It's trickery.
It's another cloth of riba.
Yes, yes. And Rasul says, "Inna riba fi ummati akhfa min dabib al-namli ala as-safa." So للأسف, this is not interest-free banking. And Shahid al-Sadr had another book,
النظام الأرباوي في الإسلام.
النظام الأرباوي في الإسلام. Yes. So in economics, the justification for interest is opportunity cost. We call this the time value of money, or the opportunity cost of waiting. But you as a lender, you have money set aside which you are not using. Someone asks you to use this money. Why do you feel obliged to impose interest? You are not using this money to begin with. And if you were going to use the money, then of course you're not going to be willing to lend it anyway. So there's no point. And by the way, profit-loss partnership existed in medieval times in Christian societies also, not only in Islamic societies. In Europe, you had profit loss partnerships, and it was working fine, but for the greedy merchants, the greedy lenders, that was not enough. They wanted more. They wanted something that was fixed, that was a multiplied profit, and that's why they had to justify usury. And in the Quran talks about a really ingenious trick used by usurers when they said, إِنَّ الْبَيْعَ مِثْلَ الرِّبَى. They're comparing trade to riba, as if riba is the reference, is the standard, and you're comparing trade to it. And then the Quran says, no, this is not the way you look at it. Trade, إِنَّمَا اللَّهُ أَحَلَّ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى. البيع is the reference, is the standard, is the normal.
وقالوا إنما البيع مثل الربا. This is what
إنما البيع مثل
أحل الله البيع وحرم الربا.
حرم الربا. So البيع, so the Quran flipped it again to its proper place. Bay'a is the normal, riba is the abnormal, is the unnatural.
Great, great. Doctor, here we reached to our final question in our interview, and let us summarize, or let us mention this important thing also. So we talked about virtues, moralities, ethics, about very utopian ideas, very great theories, by being a very great person. But then here there's 2 points. One, we live in such a capitalist era, globalized world, small village with all these technologies that are surrounding us, and all this life of materialism which attacks us. And then we are trying to have a path of virtues in life, which we are eventually will try to do that. Here we don't have a practical system, laws, legislations. How can we feel such virtues in such life? Because it will stay just as قيم عظمى or theories or لوحة جميلة ننظر إليها or سيرة الإمام علي, كلمات الإمام علي, how we can live it. And the other problem is that the era that we are living is totally in the contradiction, is 180 degrees different than such virtues. So don't you feel a very large gap? Whereas even if we wanted to be good people, we can't. I own a company. The whole system is different, so I don't know if I'm mentioning here a proper question or no.
Yes, you are. It's the most important question. In fact, it's not that the whole system is different only. The whole system is against you. Yani, capitalism, and this is a point that was made by some thinkers, that capitalism is not just a system that doesn't celebrate virtue or doesn't use virtue and sustain virtue. In fact, capitalism is a system built in such a way that if you decide to use virtue, the system will stop you from doing that. The whole system will be against you. And that's why I was in a conference once, and the conference was trying to praise the virtues of capitalism. But they were also talking about how to be virtuous in a capitalist system. And then someone asked me a question, well, how do you envision freedom within a market economy? I said, to a believer, freedom is really the freedom to be virtuous. Yani, imagine one thing we are talking about is that it's so hard to be virtuous. Okay? And another thing is, are you even allowed to be virtuous? So if إذا عندك الإرادة والنية, and then you decide, I want to be a virtuous trader, I want to be a virtuous seller or buyer, will this market even allow you to be like that? Or will the market even go as far as punishing you for being virtuous? Yani Karl Polanyi, who is a very famous historian of economic thought, said, that markets are designed, modern markets are designed in such a way that anyone who tries to be virtuous is punished. So for example, if you are a seller, you're in a competitive market, and you feel that this economy is going through hard times, your consumers, who are your neighbors, who are your friends, when they are coming to buy your stuff, you feel that they are going through hardship. You feel that they are barely making ends meet. They don't have enough money to buy your stuff. And you decide to lower prices for your customers, even lower prices in such a way that you may lose money rather than profit. The market is going to punish you for that. Because what you're doing is you're harming, the market will look at your benevolent act as if you are harming other sellers. And this is going to come back to bite you. It's going to come back to haunt you. Or if you're working at a company and you decide to be a hardworking employee, but then your other coworkers, they don't like that, because by being a hardworking employee, you are raising the bar. You're showing them to be slackers, to be not as hardworking as you are. You're going to get into trouble with your coworkers. So the problem with markets and virtue is that today's markets not only don't value or appreciate virtue, today's markets punish you for being virtuous. That being said, that is not reason for us not to be virtuous. In fact, I think that's all the more reason to be virtuous. And that again brings us to that hadith by the Prophet that no sacrifice is greater than that of a martyr. And to be placed on that same rank on Judgment Day means that the Prophet, as if the Prophet is telling us, I know that there will come a time when the virtuous trader will have to go through life as if he or she is sacrificing everything that he has. Will have to go through life with the trials that are huge and momentous. But the reward is all the more greater, because the trial is so great, the rewards will be even greater. The honor of going through these trials will be the same as the honor of someone who gave his life, and nothing is more precious than life.
Doctor, another major problem here, I think we are, as Islamic economists or Islamic thinkers, Shaykh al-Sadr wrote 2 books, اقتصادنا النظام الربوي, and other people, other academics like you and other people are writing in such an Islamic economy based on virtues and morals. But what do you think is the next step? What do we lack? Do we lack a practical system? Because we're not showing an alternative. Okay, we're talking about values, about theories which are very beautiful, but I don't think that we reach to a stage that we can present an alternative system, even a partial alternative system. I think that we have a very gap until we reach to the second stage.
Yes, great question. Any system that needs reform or has to be transformed, it happens at 2 levels. There's the institutional level and there's the behavioral level. Institutional level has to do with the structure of governance, with institutions. It has to do with rules and laws that are in place. The behavioral level has to do with humans themselves, human beings, individuals, families, neighbors, friends, relatives, co-workers. I think one of the problem we have, one of the deficiencies of what we have been doing in this field we call Islamic economics, whether in theory or practice, one of the deficiencies is most of our focus has been on the institutional side and very little focus on the behavioral side. So we have been trying to recommend policies. Let's abolish interest. Let's have a social security system. Let's call on governments to abolish interest. Let's call on governments to regulate prices. Let's call on governments to regulate gas emissions, and so on and so forth. That is essential, that is necessary. But even government officials are part of the people. What is missing is an education that starts at the personal level, at the family level, from childhood. Tarbiyah. That tarbiyah is missing. And we decided to start from on top. We don't have the luxury of leaders like Rasul alayhi salatu wassalam, or Imam Ali alayhi salam. We don't have that luxury. But what we can do is to start with ourselves, with the behavioral level. And if you slowly educate a community, a people, into the ideas of virtue, golden rule, compassion, benevolence, that we are responsible as Khalifatullah, as vicegerents, that we have to be just and what it means to be just, that charity starts at home, that you have to start with your behavior with your wife or husband and child and parent and neighbor and friend and stranger and the co-worker. And if we slowly start at that level, we educate ourselves on what it means to be a Muslim at that level and what it means to be a Muslim in a market, that I don't need the government to come and tell me that interest is a sin. I, as a Muslim, should know that riba is haram. And I should try to the best of my ability to steer away from it. That I don't need the government to come and tell me as a seller that what the price you're charging customers is too high, you're engaged in predatory pricing. I, as a seller, should know that. So this is what we're missing. I think Islamic economics has focused so much on policy. But if we had also focused at the individual level, at the personal level, at the level of educating people, then we would have created a society from within. That society will come up with individuals who believe in these policies and who will slowly instill these policies at the policy level and the institutional level.
Let me finalize with this final question, and then I'll if you have a final comment. In an Islamic economic system, can we imagine a multinational company or a great hypermarket that is there, or this can't be?
It's okay. This is interesting, because this takes me back to a question you asked and I answered in the first part. The difference between doctrine and science. The problem with answering these types of questions is that we don't live in an Islamic economic system. So it's very hard for us to imagine exactly what that economy would look like, what a virtuous market would look like once it is in place. Because let us imagine, hypothetically, that we have a market characterized by virtue, the golden rule, justice, responsibility, benevolence, compassion. I think it would be very hard for such a market or economy to have within it companies this big, because companies this big, very likely, they only became this big by going through a path of oppression, taking advantage, injustice, illegal activities. Yes. So, in other words, I think many of these questions we have about what an Islamic economy would look like will answer themselves once we are there. But we have to take the leap of faith.
Thank you, Doctor, for all the great information and knowledge and virtues you shared in this long talk. And I think it is a very important talk for anyone who wants to know about Islamic economics, virtues and ethics in an economic society. It's a very beneficial talk to listen to. If you'd like to add a final point, please do.
Okay, I of course want to thank you, very much for your time, your effort. You have been working on this for weeks, and that is much appreciated. Barakallah fiqh. And inshallah, this would be of use to others. And I wish you all the best in other discussions that you have with others, and I look forward to them. I think each and every one of them, inshallah, will have something useful and rich to offer the audience. One final thing to say, it may have seemed like an uphill battle to apply everything we have talked about in reality. ولكن لا يأس من روح الله إلا القوم الكافرون.
Great, great. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation for this interview and for being with us. And thank you for your prayers. It is mentioned in Islamic mysticism also that there is no repetition in manifestation. لا تكرار في التجلي. So every lecture, every interview, every interaction with another person will also has its own benefit and knowledge and wisdom. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.